Hi Read 585, welcome back. This is week 13, lecture part 2. And given that this is our third and final week talking about professional development, I have a lot of content for you, so please bear with me as we go through that. So our session objectives are relatively unchanged this week. We're really just deepening our level of understanding. So you'll recall back in week 10, we were really focused on identifying the principles of effective professional development with the goal of being able to apply those principles and create a structure for developing and delivering professional development. So those are still our goals. We are going to again look at those principles, add some new principles, and then determine some different approaches, look at some more case studies like we did in week 12 of some effective professional development models in various schools. So just a quick review of those design principles. First and foremost, we have that the professional development directly connects to student learning goals that are clear and accepted by all. So you might recall back to the idea of the golden circle, and in the middle of the circle is the why. Why are you here as an organization or a school? To improve student learning. That's why you exist. So any and all professional development also must be focused on improving student learning outcomes. Design principle 2, it needs to be an active learning process for teachers. Just like when we teach our students, they're not going to be able to apply information that they just hear. They need to interact with it. Same thing with teachers. You need to practice what you preach. And the article this week, the Fisher-Fry article, talks a little bit about that as well, not doing the sit and get. Also, it needs to be embedded in the context of work in schools and in classrooms. This is essentially saying that it needs to be relevant to the work that's happening in your classroom, which many of you commented on as well. Fourth, we have that it needs to be continuous and ongoing, so it shouldn't just be 1 or 2 hours and that's the end. It should be continually occurring and ongoing for at least a year, if not longer. Design principle 5 is that it is related to teacher learning, student learning, and what we know about good instruction, and it's a focused inquiry, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the process of inquiry. And then design principle 6 is that coherence piece. It needs to be evident in all aspects of the professional development system. So we aren't focusing on 8 different things. We are focusing on one thing and going deep with that, and then the work that we're doing in our professional learning communities supports our school goals, supports what we're looking for in walkthroughs. It all aligns, it's coherent, goes with our school-wide goals, etc. So taking a look at some of your thoughts from our week 10 discussion forum, you all had great insight as to what professional development could and should be. Being recipients of a lot of professional development, you rightfully so have strong opinions. So some of the thoughts I thought you would enjoy hearing are as such, starting with Elvira. I think that professional development does not consist of prepackaged programs. When teachers feel that PDs are run as the delivery of canned goods, they immediately turn off their attention and switch to sidebar conversations. In order for professional development to be successful, reading specialists need to take into account the school's resources, the configuration of the faculty, and the students' population. Teachers are more willing to buy into a school-wide literacy program when they have been part of the gathering of the baseline data and when they are part of the decision-making process. It is the sense of community that allows a year-long professional development to be successful. So that is exactly right. The pre-packaged program may not be effective for your school, and that's why you need to cater the professional development to your school, and I don't know how many times I've been to a professional development where they present their spiel to you, this outside organization, and then you're like, well, what does that really look like at our school? I don't even know if this is realistic to do it this way at our school. So thinking through all of those variables that are mentioned here in her post are very important to be done. More thoughts from Susan. I also feel strongly that PD sessions need to be modified to cater to a specific group. So similar point. Oftentimes companies bring in a PD person to facilitate a session around a particular topic, but in fact there's not a need for information about that topic, or it doesn't apply to everyone involved in the PD session. If the HR person dug a little bit deeper, and I know Susan's coming from corporate America here, they quite possibly find that this is not a need of the people and often is just filling a necessary annual PD quota. I think if companies took the time to poll their people about what they're seeing as a need and are very familiar with the daily routines, challenges, and successes of those on the firing line, then they could manage to have a gratifying and effective professional development session. And Susan, I completely agree with you. It takes a lot of work, pre-work, to develop your professional development plan, but that is so necessary. And as part of that pre-work, you should be getting feedback from the teachers about what they feel like their areas for improvement are, where they would like to get growth. Invest them in the process. Show them the data, like we saw in the article last week with the case of two schools. In the second school, they showed them the data and we're like, look at this. What should we do about this? What do we need PD and what do we need to focus our efforts around? And that really built that sense of community, like Elvira mentioned as well. Next thought comes from Kayla. The last component that makes professional development successful, I believe, is that teachers' prior knowledge on the subject matter being covered should be honored and incorporated into the professional development. She also mentions about, essentially people turning off when they feel like it's something they've already heard. And this is so true. We need to value the education in the room, and we need to harness all of our as I'll talk about later in the lecture, making it an intellectual, stimulating environment experience, learning experience, instead of just pretending nobody has any background knowledge about this and I'm here, I'm going to teach you how to change the world in an hour or less or however long I have. There's a strategy coming up in a second from Kim to also address that as well. So here's a tip from Christina Vicente, who says that relevance is a key component of a successful PD. Relevance is a key component to any learning that takes place, your students included. The staff needs to see that what they are interacting with matters to their students. Last year when my staff and I worked through text complexity, one kindergarten teacher raised the question, what does this have to do with kinder students? So for my K-1 teachers this year, I've tied in text complexity with close listening and academic conversations. I showed a video of Doug Fisher from San Diego State who shows how close reading might look, what it might look like for emergent readers. I've also modeled lessons and collaboratively planned with teachers. So lots of great ideas here for you as you develop PD. First, making it relevant to the subject grade level content area they teach. Second, providing models via videos and modeling lessons. And then third, collaborating, problem solving, being able to be a resource and plan. Another great tip, like I said, from Kim, to help you honor the participants in the room. So on a half sheet of paper, having them answer what is literacy or what are you hoping to have answered today. And this can serve as your icebreaker. And then they realize that they can hopefully learn and gain something from the session. It sets that stage sets the stage of that mentality of a growth mindset. And you get out of the session what you put into this session. So coming with that motivation and desire to learn something. So it sets the purpose for the time together, and then at the end it can serve as an exit sheet. One thing I've done to start sessions is to do a four corners activity where in the different corners of the room I've had different images of a road. I think I showed you earlier my one PD where we had the dirt road and the superhighway. So I have like a dirt road, a gravel road, a paved road, and then the superhighway. And then they have to designate which corner they would place themselves in regarding familiarity with the topic. So if this is something you aren't very comfortable with or have a lot of background knowledge, you would go to the dirt road versus you've already had PD on this, you would go to the superhighway, and it helps you quickly gauge as a facilitator who is where, who you can call on during the session for examples and applications, who you need to check in with during the session. If you want to break into groups at any point in the session, you could do it by level of expertise, or you could mix them up so that the expertise can be distributed throughout the groups as well. Some more great thinking from Christina Allen. One idea that I find convincing is how a clear statement of what students and teachers must know and be able to do should drive the professional development. So just like you have a learning objective for your students, maybe an I can statement or an essential question you're trying to answer, same thing with your professional development. What is your purpose? What is your guiding question? Why are you here? What is your objective for the day or the week or the year? All of that should be communicated to your staff up front so they know what to expect and when to expect it, what your agenda is in your PD plan. Jess says, I think that purpose and engagement are key factors because there must be a clear intention for the growth taking place, and motivation comes from that validation. Collaboration and time to plan and put into practice are also important because teachers can help each other to clear up misconceptions or share ideas. Then they need time to comprehend and apply the strategies to then return to coaches and specialists for assistance in fine tuning. Finally, they need to do reflection and follow up. So she has a lot of great pieces identified here. So in addition to the learning, time to collaborate and process and then practice, time to discuss, to clear up misconceptions and share ideas, then more application, fine tuning, reflection. As you can see, it's a continual process, a cyclical process, if you will, and I will give you a structure for that in a second. Regarding active participation, Jen says that's what she underlined in principle number 2. She recalls that those PDs with greatest impact on her practice are ones when she walked away, being able to immediately apply what she learned in her classroom. So that idea of relevance. The before, during, and after professional development meeting framework sounds like an effective way to help teachers deepen their understanding. She likes how each session begins by asking teachers to share how they applied their previous learning in their classrooms. One teacher could have applied it one way, someone could have ran into a problem, and someone has a different approach. So basically validating the work that they're doing, recognizing their efforts, giving them an opportunity to collaborate. Elizabeth mentions that professional development needs to be more than a lecture series. That is exactly right. There should also be one focus, as Erin mentions, when she was soliciting feedback from teachers at her school about her project, they really felt it would be important to focus on one area instead of having many different trainings on many different things to improve upon. So making sure that teachers actually have time to delve into the subjects deeply instead of doing breadth, doing depth, just like Common Core wants us to do. And the last thought from Sarah, to make professional development successful, I think requires the right topic, yes, and the promise or means of using the training, exactly right. The topic of the training needs to connect directly to things that are in need at the school or things that the teachers already do and want to refine. Great. So you need a topic that is connected to your school-wide goals, which should be supported by the data. The data needs to show why that is an area of need and why you need to do more development in that area. And it should be relevant, and then they should be able to take it into their classrooms and apply it. And if teachers can see where the application fits, then they will be invested in the training. She also believes that teachers and administrators need to be co-creators in professional development. By that, I mean that teachers need to be a part of making the decisions for the training, including the topic, the length, type, and style, be a part of that process, and they will be invested in their own training. And that is a best practice identified in the Fisher Frey article from this week, where it talks about the task force members really developing the professional development plan and linking those opportunities to the literacy framework that the school is embodying. So everyone on back in week 10 on the discussion forum had a lot of insight to add to professional development, and I think having experienced so much of it, you are aware of what makes for a good professional development. So don't be afraid to draw on those experiences as you create your plans and as you develop professional development for your school sites and for your district. All right, moving on. This week we had two articles to read. The first comes from a publication by the National Staff Development Council, the NSDC, and the entire publication is titled Designing Powerful Professional Development for Teachers and Principals. You had to read chapter 9. Now, I wanted to update you. This publication was originally released in 2002. Since then, the NSDC has become the organization Learning Forward. So if you go to learningforward.org, that's where you can find a lot of information. So unfortunately, a lot of these links within this piece are no longer at that domain. So you'll have to look for them elsewhere, perhaps on the learningforward.org website. So another thing that they did is they originally had 12 professional development standards, and they recently revised it, I believe in 2010 as well, to 7. So if you go to this link, you can read there. Yep, I guess not that link. Here to the standards link. This will give you their 7 standards for professional learning. So first they have the learning communities, and if you click on each of these, it'll give you a video about the learning communities and then more information. Unfortunately, they have this great publication, but it requires that you have a subscription, which is about $60 to $90 depending on if it's paper or digital. But this is an organization I definitely want to get more learning from. But they talk about the purpose of the learning community, and we've actually gone through this process last week. I explained it to you, using the data, creating a goal, determining your learning, implementing best practices, evaluating, using evidence to monitor, and then evaluating the results. So learning communities are one of their principles. Next is leadership, and how is leadership involved? Are they developing capacity for learning and leading? Are they advocating for professional learning? Are they creating the support systems and structures necessary? So leadership is a key component in a standard. Also resources, data, learning designs, implementation, outcome. So this might want to be, or this would be learningforward.org would be a nice site for you to visit to get more information on standards for professional development. So in regard to chapter 9 that you read, there are a few key themes that emerged. First, looking at professional development as continuing education. So developing the expertise of your teachers, and we saw that earlier in this semester, how important that is to have highly qualified teachers who aren't just stopping and always relying on the same methods, because those same methods won't always be effective. So really developing them, making them aware of current research and new methods, and what new strategies or things are popular in the literature. So really looking at professional development as that opportunity to continue education and to develop the expertise of your teachers. Next, support from the top is essential for PD to work, and that comes up, I just showed you on the website, Leaders need to have a vision for the PD and need to be developing capacity for the PD. Next theme, teachers need training on how to use data. I know that you've had some great training on how to use data, both in 516 and in this course. But in the article, it mentions that teachers might not always be very comfortable looking at data, so they're going to need some training on how to look at formal sources of data as well as formative sources of data and being able to use the formative assessment process. Also, looking at student work samples is something that would require training. What do you look for with those? Also, demonstrating for adults, match their learning processes, don't lecture. So in here it discusses how powerful professional development matches the adult learning processes to intended outcomes. So this is kind of a complex idea, but basically leaders need to first think about what the student learning outcomes need to be and then think about what the teacher outcomes need to be in order to achieve the student learning outcomes, and then they need to backwards map the adult learning to produce those results. And the learning needs to be more than workshops. They need to collaborate in serious and sustained ways. And the number one takeaway is that you should focus on a small number of goals. All right. So here's that structure I mentioned. You begin with the plan phase, then you do the teach and act, then the reflect, and then you repeat. And this is part of the new teacher center from the University of California, Santa Cruz. You are welcome to visit their website. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot of their great tools. They have a lot of tools to use for mentoring and coaching that I will definitely have to integrate in lectures for our coaching unit, but they have a lot of great tools you can use with teachers. But this is their process they recommend. In the planning phase, you need to establish a focus for your work based on assessed teacher and student needs. So what are we doing and why are we doing it? What data do we have that supports this work? Next, determine the outcomes aligned with the professional and content standards. So why are we here, and then what are we looking to accomplish? What's our goal? Identify the evidence that you're looking for success, and then start to develop the strategies and a plan. So this is all happening in the planning phase, and then you go into the teach act. So then you teach the lesson, you model a lesson or strategy, you collect evidence during that teaching, or you can even observe a veteran teacher. So the teaching piece happens, and then the last part to close the loop is the reflect piece. So analyzing the student work with reference to the standards. So this is what we wanted students to learn. This was our goal. And in our reflection, did they accomplish that? Assessing your practice against professional standards, identify successes and challenges, and then to clarify next steps. And then you go into it again. This was effective, this wasn't effective, so here's my plan to address that. Let's teach it again. Let's go back and reflect. So you're constantly doing this cycle of inquiry throughout the whole year to lead to student achievement. So action research, if you will. So I enjoyed this quote. The discussions that lead up to the creation of the vision are a form of professional development and adult learning that generates a sense of ownership of new ideas and practices rather than mere program buy-in. So many of you mentioned the importance of investing teachers in the professional development. And how are you going to do that? By getting their feedback, by discussing with them what the vision of their professional development should be, their hopes for adult learning, like Kim shared, having them write down what they want to learn from the session, what they want to gain, having them make professional development goals for themselves. So what doesn't work? Large group PD, aka batch processing. So if you've ever been part of your school or district when they rolled out a new curriculum or a new program, and you've got the one size fits all overview of here's how you do the program, usually comes from someone outside of your school or organization that isn't familiar with your context, that just tells you here's how you do it, kind of a batch processing method without looking at the nuances or the ways you need to adapt it to your setting. If you're lucky, you had that initial training, but if you came to a school after they've already had that training, you aren't likely to get any sort of training, which isn't a good thing either. Also, talking at teachers doesn't work. Exposing them to ideas doesn't work. You need to provide that practice time. Just by hearing something, I don't feel compelled to implement it. So what PD often is but shouldn't be? Fragmented PD. Ideas spitballed out in rapid fire. Here, try this, try this, try this. Or, in September we have a PD on this. In October we have a PD on something completely different. Then in March we're talking about another idea. That is also fragmented PD. Ideas are not rooted in theory or research or tied to data. So, as we saw in previous readings, you need to look at your data and then use that to plan your PD. PD lacks intellectual rigor. I talked about this piece as well. Teachers need to learn and grow and develop from the PD. If you're giving them information they already know, they're not going to be invested or motivated in the PD. It should be a good use of their time. Time is such a scarce resource to teachers. So if you're going to spend 3 hours of their time, make sure that what you're providing in the session is what they actually need, and getting their input to make sure it's something that they need, and then making it interesting, making it intellectual. What PD should be, it often fails to build on existing knowledge. So like a few of you mentioned, we can't just disregard the human capital that sits in front of us. We need to build on those resources. And then PD doesn't meet day-to-day needs. So this PD is great, but it doesn't align to anything I'm doing in my classroom. It's not relevant to me. I don't know how to implement it. So we need to get away from that. What PD should be, it should be sustained over time, and it should be intensive. It should focus on academic subject matter. That kind of goes without saying. It should give teachers opportunities for hands-on work. I think you have the idea on that. It should be integrated into the daily life of schools and be something you can implement in your classroom right away. Use information related to student learning for various purposes. So you need to collect that data on student learning to develop your staff goals, to guide and motivate teacher learning, to monitor the impact of staff development on achievement, as well as make appropriate mid-course corrections. I know this is something my staff has struggled with a little bit in their PLC cycles of improvement. They fail to monitor and then make corrections. Student work is also important to review, and then you can connect it to the 4 PLC questions. So the Dufours are pretty famous for the PLC idea, but then also there are 4 questions of what do we want students to learn, how do we know they learned it, if they learned it, now what are we going to do to extend it, if they didn't learn it, what are we going to do to reteach it. So prior to implementing PLCs, most of our teams, our grade level teams, had really great team meetings weekly. They talked about things like field trips and do we need more pencils and materials and supplies and logistical things, but they weren't really examining student data and talking about student learning and outcomes. So by implementing the PLC cycles and really focusing them on those 4 questions, what do we want students to learn and how do we know they've learned it, we're able to focus them more on student learning data and outcomes. Also, here is the website that has those recommendations for if you are examining student work. Last week we talked about goals, and again, a key takeaway from the National Staff Development Council piece was that PD should relate back to school goals and only be focused on a small number of goals. Think SMART goals. They should require high expectations for all students, and a SWOT analysis is one of many ways to determine the student learning goals you should work toward. Professional development matches adult learning processes to intended outcomes. So, professional development does not need to be in one type of format. It doesn't have to be a workshop or a course. You can use many different learning methods and processes. In fact, they should match the methods you would like adults to use with their students. For instance, if you want teachers to work with students in small groups, then they need to have the opportunity to practice work in small groups as well. All right, let's switch and talk about article number 2, implementing a school-wide literacy framework. My favorite quote from this was on the first page, which says, "We do not need more prescriptive scripted curriculum. Instead, we need precision in our teaching. This precision comes when teachers have an extensive knowledge base and make expert decisions based on data about the instructional needs of their students." So that is the goal, developing teacher expertise so that they can use their knowledge to make decisions based on data to meet student needs. So, Rosa Parks Elementary School was the lowest performing school in the area. In 1999, their API was 455. They increased this by 291 points in 6 years. So by 2005, their API was 746. Even more impressive was that their growth targets for each subgroup every year between 1999 and 2005 exceeded the state growth targets. So very impressive. What do they do and how can we do it? So the good news is they outlined their process, but the bad news is you need to apply it to your school setting. You can't just take what they did and use it. You need to go through the process they did. So what they did was they created a task force to develop a multi-year school-wide literacy plan. So for their literacy plan, they first identified their core beliefs regarding literacy instruction at their school. So thinking about what is important to us in how we teach literacy. Well, to them, learning is social was important. Conversations are critical for learning. They talked about the zone of proximal development. Reading, writing, and oral language must be integrated, which I know we talked about in 516. Also, the gradual increase of responsibility. So those were their core beliefs. So then once they had those core beliefs, developing a framework to guide their instructional decisions. So within their framework, they made a plan for literacy development. Starting with teacher modeling, they felt that was very important. So they first focused on that. Then they talked about independent learning, and then they realized we are not bridging the modeling to the independent learning. So then they looked at small group instruction and came up with some guidelines for flexible grouping patterns, collaborative learning, and small groups. Then they implemented their literacy plan and monitored how it went. They included a feedback loop where the task force members from each grade level were responsible for keeping their colleagues informed of progress and then getting their feedback. They also did building walkthroughs to get feedback and to monitor the progress. What PD was provided? Well, for starters, they had a professional development committee who plans all learning experiences a school year in advance. We are lucky if we plan our PD a month in advance, and I really wish we were at a place where we could plan all the PD for the following year a year ahead of time. I loved the part on page 38 where it talks about how The professional development plan is linked purposefully to the literacy framework, and that teachers are the ones designing, developing, and implementing the professional development plan, and that the plan is a public document. So there is decision-making power there for teachers, and it's developed a year in advance of implementation. Together, teachers create and own their learning, and as a result, more and more people implement what they learn in professional development sessions. Wow, I have 2 stars next to that with the word ideal, because I wish that was the reality in my school. So the plan is carefully linked with the literacy framework. The teachers design, develop, and implement the plan. They utilize whole school seminars. They also have grade level sessions where teachers examine student work. My guests thinking about those questions of what do we want them to learn and how do we know they learned it? So looking at the student work sample, what is the evidence that they learned what we wanted them to? Also, I've recently been reading Assignments Matter, and it talks about backwards mapping your assignment so that you have the assignment before you plan the instruction. And then when you make your assignment, you also make the rubric at the same time. And then you actually do your assignment so that way you have a model, and in doing your assignment you can think about, oh, I need to prepare students to include this, and you can help refine your rubric for what you're looking for. So that's a very important process. All right, small group sessions were also used where teachers shared examples from instruction. They had learning communities 2 times a month, and they had peer coaching because they had 5 full-time peer coaches, literacy specialists. Wow, I would like to work at that school because you can tell they are very focused on growth. So what do the learning communities do? They set an agenda, they have their professional readings, they discuss the readings, they share student work, they make plans to change, they observe instruction in each other's rooms, and then note how students respond to changes in instruction. Who's holding them accountable? Well, really they're holding themselves accountable. They type up meeting notes at the end or by Friday after their meeting, and then they present after their final meeting. So this is all very teacher driven. There's not a lot of top down authority holding them accountable, which is great. That's the ideal. That's what it should be. Go Rosa Parks. All right, their findings. They had a lot of positive success as evidenced by their 292-point increase. They also found that after this process, their school had a very common purpose, and that is the goal with the PD, right? To have purpose aligned with school-wide goals. The peer coach commented, it's like our teachers have internalized an instructional framework. They don't just get up there and do strategies. They know why they're doing something and how it fits into their overall goals. They understand what their students know and don't know and how to close the gap. So they have this purpose, this common purpose. Also, another great byproduct of their process was an increase in instructional time and time on task. So students were more focused as a result of them doing the modeling and then the small groups and then the independent work. They also had improved student habits and continuity because of the cohesive framework happening in each grade and in each classroom. They commented on how they could tell which students were new to the school that year because they weren't familiar with the process because it was so ingrained in everybody else. And then they felt that there was more professional learning happening because teachers were leading workshops, they were leading their learning communities. There were comments about past experiences with professional development and how it was a lot of sit and get, but now they're more actively participating in their PD. They've done, all these different opportunities with seminars, but then also peer-led sessions. So lots of rich PD happening, and it's no wonder that they had gains with their students because it was all very focused they were active, it was cohesive, it embodied all of those principles of effective professional development. So, wow, that was a lot of lecture, which is exactly what I'm telling you not to do. Oh, good grief. But I'm giving you a project to apply your learning, right? That was our goal, is to start to develop your structure for delivering your own professional development. All right, to launch you, I have this seagull to remind you of not being a seagull consultant who flies in, drops something off, and then flies away. So with that, have a great week 13. I will see you back next week where we will start our unit on coaching and the reading specialist as an instructional coach. I know many of you are really looking forward to this unit to get some tools and ideas for developing yourself as a coach. So see you next week. Have a great week. Let me know if you need anything.